So this project starts out very simple, just a handful of layers. We have this bottle, has an alpha channel, a little bit of transparency in it. You can see through it if you drag it around. The bottle is animated to spin around. We shot it against a black background and keyed it out so that we could work with it with transparency. We turn off that layer. We also have 3 different waterfall clips. We've got this sort of splashy waterfall. We've got this really soft waterfall with the water falling slowly by. We have another variation on that same kind of feel with a little bit more water and a few other splashes going around. We're going to start with this as a main background, and now just by adding a little bit of text in After Effects and then using a few compositing tricks like masks and transfer modes, we're going to create a really nice final result. Let's start out with After Effects 6's most exciting new feature, text. We'll click on the Type tool, and that immediately opens up the character palette by default. The character palette is where you choose your font, it's where you size things, it's where you adjust leading. Basically, it's where you do everything to text that you would do inside of any other Adobe application. Now I'm just going to click inside of the window with my Type tool and type the word wet. That's going to be the central word of our animation. We've got a nice, big, chunky, easy-to-read font. That's a good place to start. Let me bring down my tool palette a little bit so that I can see my selection tool. I'm going to click on that. And I'm going to reposition my word just a little bit so that it's centered up and down in the comp. And if I pan over, we'll see it's very slightly closer to the right-hand side of the comp than to the left-hand side of the comp. That's so we can leave room for the bottle to come in a little bit later. Now I'm going to hit Command-T on the Mac or Control-T on Windows to get back to my Type tool. Let's add another word. I'm going to add the word more in lowercase. But this type is much too big, and it's not the font that I want to use. So I'm going to select all. I'm going to hide the selection by hitting Command-Shift-H or Control-Shift-H on Windows, but the text is still selected, so any changes that I make over here in the palette will be immediately affected. Now I can interact with the palette the same way I would in other Adobe applications. If I want to change the font size, for example, I can dial in any of a number of preset fonts if I want to, or I can select and type in any font size number that I want to get to, and the up and down arrow keys will let me size things on the fly as well. But the quickest way to interact with the palette is by scrubbing the icons to the left of each of these fields. And if I take this type size down to something like 90, maybe 100 pixels or so, that's going to be a size that's going to work a little bit better for us. Now I need to pick a different font. So let's click up here in the font name group, and I'm just going to hit the up arrow key and try to find a font that I like, something that has a serif to it. So I can sit here, and every time I hit the arrow, I can see the update in the window. Or I can just type exactly the font I want to go to. So if I knew I wanted to go to Adobe Caslon, for example, I could jump straight to Adobe Caslon by typing it in. And of course, I can also dial in any member of the family with the pop-up that's down below. So let's pick Adobe Caslon semi-bold italic. I'm going to once again adjust the position of that a little bit by using the arrow keys. I'm going to put that just above the letter W in wet. And now that I've got the type set up just the way I want it, I'm just going to hit Command-D to duplicate this type layer and drag the copy down somewhere close to here. Once again, I'll hit Command-T to get my type tool back, and I'll select this type in here, and I'll change it. I'll change it to less fat. Hit the Return key on the numeric keypad to accept that change, and now our type layers are set up so I can get rid of the character palette, and we can continue with our composition. Now the next thing I want to do is get these last 2 bits of text out of the way because we're not going to worry about them right now. I'm just going to turn off their eyeballs and let's concentrate on our wet layer. Now we want to animate this layer and we want to take advantage of some cool animation abilities inside of After Effects' new text engine. Let me actually pan our composition a little closer so we can see it a bit more clearly. It's one of the cool things about After Effects 6 is you can pan freely into the pasteboard like this. And I'm going to twirl open the properties for this text layer. And one of the first things that we'll see in the properties is this little animate pop-out switch. And if I choose that, I'll see a list of all of the various different properties I can animate within the text. I'm going to choose several, as a matter of fact. I'm going to choose position to start with. A new animator property shows up down in the timeline, and if we work our way down, you'll see the word position here. That's the position property I just added. I'm also going to add a scale property. I'm also going to add a skew property. I'll also add a rotation property, and I'll be adjusting all of these things to create an interesting animation. I'm just going to adjust these one at a time. First, I'll adjust the rotation of the letters. Note that they don't rotate as a word by default. They rotate by individual letters. I'm also going to skew them a little bit to give them a little bit of an angle. I'm going to turn off the link for scale property so that I can just scale the x-axis down to make them really thin. And the last thing I'm going to do is adjust their position slightly to the right and a great deal up from where they are now, so they're off the top of the screen. So in essence, what I've done is set a starting position for my type off the top of the screen. And now the really interesting part is, because I've done that work, I don't have to actually animate keyframes for any of those properties. Now all I have to adjust is the range selector for this type, and that will drop these letters into screen one at a time, each of them moving, rotating, and distorting according to the information that I just built in. Now it turns out, in fact, that the range selector property that I need to adjust is the start property. I'll basically animate it from 0 to 100, and in the course of doing that, the 3 letters will pop onto screen one at a time. So let's do that really quickly. I'm going to go out to about 2 seconds. I'm going to set a keyframe for start. Let me jump out to about 5 seconds until you can see 5 in the time code down here. And I'm going to now scrub that start position to 100. And the results are, as we tap the space bar, that each letter pops in one at a time. Doink. Doink. So that's our main animation for our main body of text. The next step is I want to use this text animation that I just created as a track mat for one of our waterfall layers. If I scroll down and collapse down these properties, because I don't need to work on them anymore, just got my wet layer by itself here, I'm actually going to want to use the wet text as a track mat for this waterfall layer, waterfall movie number 3. So I'm going to move it directly beneath our text layer and over under my track mat settings. And if you don't see these, just click on this button to toggle between switches and transfer modes, which includes the track mats. And I'm going to choose Alpha Mat Wet. And now the word wet is filled up with a contrasting waterfall movie, so you can actually read the text, and it sort of looks like it's living in the same world because they're both filled with waterfalls, but one's a little different from the other. And of course, because it's a track mat, it completely respects the animation that we just did. Now let's see what we can do to add some more realistic liquid behavior to this animation. We'll start out by creating some masks that correspond to the type that we see here on screen. And fortunately, we can take advantage of a really cool After Effects feature to do that. We'll just select our type layer at any point in the timeline where we're at the final position for the letters. So this frame will do just fine. And we're going to go up to the Layer menu, and we're going to choose Create Outlines. That's going to take our type layer and create a new solid, and masks on that solid are going to correspond to the outlines of this text. So Create Outlines, and you'll see here at the top of our composition, starting at this point, we now have a white solid with masks defining the letters W, E, and T to make up the word wet. Now I still have my original text layer selected, so I'm going to hit F2 to deselect that, and then just click on our foreground image, and you can clearly see the mask outlines that define these shapes. So we're going to actually animate these mask outlines to create a little cascade of water that comes off of each letter as it comes into place in the scene. So let's scroll back to the point where the W basically hits its mark. So right there. So that's the layer that I'm going to want to start my wet outline. So I'm going to hit the left bracket key to snap our selected layer to that point in the timeline. And I'm actually going to go up, hold down the Option key on the Mac, Alt on Windows, and click on the E and click on the T, adding the Shift key to select those two masks. And then with no modifier key held down, I'm going to click and start dragging, add the Shift key, and drag these masks up off the top of the screen, only leaving the W down here in the comp window. So I'm going to hit the M key, and that's going to reveal my mask shapes down here in the timeline. I'm going to now scroll forward to about 4 seconds or so. That should be approximately the point where the E plops into place, and sure enough it is. Now just one frame before it hits its mark, I'm going to set a keyframe for the mask shape that represents the letter E. Once again, just to make sure that I only set a keyframe for the E when I have two masks selected, I'm going to hit the F2 key to deselect everything, and now I'm going to click on the stopwatch for the letter E. That's going to set a keyframe at this frame, and then I'm going to page down one frame, and in that one frame, I'm going to bring our E down into place. So the result is, from here to here, that mask is just going to pop into place. Next, I want to scrub to the point in the timeline where the letter T drops into place. And just as I did with the letter E, I'm going to stop on the frame just before the T falls into place. And I'm going to go back over here and set a keyframe for mask shape for our letter T mask. Move one frame forward and then drag that mask down into place. So now our results are pretty clear. As I scrub through the timeline, the W pops into place, and as soon as it hits its mark, boom, there's a mask there. As soon as the second one hits its mark, boom, there's a mask there. As soon as the third one hits its mark, boom, there's a mask there. Now, what are we going to do with these masks? Turns out we're actually going to animate them. So let me go back to the place where the W first makes its appearance, right there at 3 seconds. I'm going to pan down just a little bit in my timeline, and I'm going to set a keyframe for mask shape for the letter W here. And now I'm going to move forward approximately a second. This doesn't have to be terribly precise. And over the course of this second, I'm actually going to animate this mask so that the points fall off screen in a kind of an organic way. So they don't all tumble at the same speed. They kind of break up the bottom level just a little bit. And I'm also going to taper out the edges a little bit because this is actually going to represent the path of water cascading down off of the top of our letter W. So we want it to move out just a little bit. And also, we can scrub back and watch that interpolation happen. I'm actually going to find a point about halfway through here and bulge things out even further. And that should give us a nice animation when we play it back at full speed. So now I'm going to do the same thing with our letter E. We already have a keyframe setting the start point of the E, so I'm just going to scrub forward to about 5 seconds or so, and I'm going to animate the E off the bottom of the screen. If I click and drag the lower left-hand point over and taper that out, you'll see we're getting a little intersection problem here, but I'll show you how to fix that in just a second. Now I'm going to drag all of these bits off screen. Got an extra point there, but that's okay. Let's bring all of these together, all of these down screen, until we're getting a nice tapered version, once again, of our mask streaming from the top of the E. And lastly, I'm going to jump out to about 6 seconds or so, which is approximately the point where the T's mask should animate itself off the bottom of the screen. And I'll just do the same thing that I did before. Let me click and drag these bits off to here. That's good. Now solving these intersections is really easy. I just go down to my mask modes, and for E, instead of difference, I want to choose add. And for the T mask, instead of difference, I want to choose add. And that'll fill in all of those holes. So the result now is as each letter falls into place, boom, I get a mask spilling down. And just as we did with the text, I'm now going to use this as a track mat for our water layer. Now, one more thing I want to do with the masks is to fuzzy them up a little bit. They're all a little sharp-edged now for this soft water business that we've got going on here. So I'm going to select all of my masks and hit the F key to bring up feather for each of these masks. And making sure that the feather properties are all selected, I'm just going to scrub one of these properties. And as I scrub one, all 3 of them are going to adjust. Now, a little of that was off screen, but I've selected all 3 of the mask feathers, and by scrubbing them to about 15, I've created a nice soft edge for the masks. So now I'm going to collapse this down. Don't need to work on any of the masks anymore. And I'm going to go down here and choose my Waterfall 3 layer. This is the same waterfall movie that I filled my letters W, E, and T with. And I'm going to use that same layer, or rather a transparent version of it, to fill these masks that we just created. So I'm going to select it. I'm going to choose Duplicate. Now it's going to make a copy that also has its track mat set by default to alpha, which is fine. But the track mat looks at whatever the layer is above itself for the source of the mat. Now we don't want it to look at the text layer that says more. We want it to use our wet outlines. We're going to bring those down here above the waterfall movie, turn off the visibility of that layer because we just want to use it as a mat. And now to really punch out the effect of this up here in our comp window, I want to adjust the transfer mode of our second waterfall layer to something that's really going to brighten things up. Let's choose Add. It's brightening things up a little too much. So with the waterfall layer selected, I'll hit T for transparency, and crank down the opacity of this layer to something around 50% or so. And now let's see what we've got. I'm going to generate a quick RAM preview. Let me first bring our composition back into a relative centered view. And let's take a look at what the early results look like. And when the results are previewed into RAM, you can clearly see that we're pretty much on our way. It looks pretty good, actually. The text comes into place, a little stuttery there. As soon as it hits, get this nice spray of water coming down. Looks very organic, looks very nice. Now I want to add a little bit of what looks like sort of particle splashes on tops of things, but I don't want to use a fake particle system to pull that off. Particle systems are great. You can do amazing things with them, but when you're trying to recreate nature, if you have the option of using real nature first, always pick real nature because it's just going to look better. And as it turns out, we have a nice clip in this composition that contains some little splashes that we'll be able to use. We're going to want them to start around the point where the W first hits its position and the water starts to cascade off. That's where we're going to want our splashy splash layer to start. So let's scroll down here and find the layer that we want to use, and that's going to be Waterfall 1. So I'm going to turn on its visibility, and I'm going to drag it up above the wet outlines clip, which is basically above everything that we currently see in the window, which is fine. Now I'm going to do some tricks with masks. Let's start out by masking out just the white foamy areas of this waterfall. We don't want any of the green. We don't want, in fact, any of the dark portion of the fall. We're only going to want to keep the light portion. So I'm going to draw a very quick and dirty mask. It doesn't need to be terribly precise. Just something that masks off most of the top edge that we have to deal with and this little corner down here. So that's done. That's good. I'm going to hit the F key to bring up the mask feather for that particular mask, and I'm just going to fuzzy things up a little bit by clicking and dragging somewhat. Now I'm also going to set the transfer mode of this layer to lighten as well. And I could choose add, but I think I'm actually going to choose a different transfer mode. Let's go with classic color dodge. That should give us, I think, a really nice blown out effect that we can then adjust back by playing with the transparency modes down here in the timeline. My next step is to adjust the scale of this layer slightly. It's a little bit bigger than we really need it, so I'm going to scale it down somewhat. I'm going to grab our pointer tool and reposition it so that the splashes are actually occurring up here near the top of our W layer. That's just fine. And now I'm going to add a second mask, and that second mask is going to be designed to simply taper off this bottom portion of our layer. And it's also going to fuzzy up the edges just a little bit. So let me pan over just a smidge. I'm going to select the rectangular mask tool, and I'm going to draw yet another mask. This one's starting way up near the top of this layer, and then coming down into the center of the white area and cropping off just a little bit of the left and just a little bit of the right. We'll let that go. A quick tap of the letter F reveals the feather properties for these masks. I can scroll our window up so we can see them more clearly. I'm going to want this second mask to intersect with the first one, so I'm going to change its transfer mode to intersect. That's good. Now I want to feather the mask a lot in the vertical and only a little bit in the horizontal, so I'm going to turn off that switch and adjust our horizontal masking up to a value of about 20, 25 or so, but our vertical masking I'm going to really crank to a value of something like 120 or so. And that's going to give us this nice tapered effect up here with a little bit of soft edges on the left and the right. Now I still have my mask tool selected, so I'm going to create one more mask. It's going to be another intersection mask. I'm going to start out by drawing it fairly small though. I'm just going to draw it over here around where the letter W is. That's going to be our starting point for the mask. And it can encompass everything that we've done so far. And once again, by default, I'm coming in with the wrong mode for the mask. I want to change this mask's mode to intersect, just as we did with the previous one. And that's going to basically isolate only this portion of the mask. And again, we're going to need to feather the edge of it a little bit. So I'll hit the letter F a couple of times until I find the feather property for that mask. And horizontal and vertical doesn't really matter. We're just going to adjust the fuzziness of that a bit so that we get a nice soft edge on the right-hand side. Now, obviously, we're blowing out all of the detail that we have here. So I'm going to hit the letter T to adjust just the transparency of this layer, and I'm going to crank it down until we can see the splashes, but they're otherwise very subtle. And that's the value I'm looking for, somewhere around there. Now all that remains is for us to animate the scale of this layer a little bit. We don't need to worry about the masks anymore right now. I'd much rather just pay attention to the splashes themselves. So I'm going to temporarily toggle the masks off by hitting the mask switch here in the comp window. That turns off all of our mask display. And I'm going to scroll forward, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 frames after the mask first appears. And I'm going to hit the letter S to solo the scale property for that mask layer and set a keyframe. Now I'll jump right back to about 3 seconds where the splashes are due to start. And I'm going to come down here, turn off the switch for symmetric scaling, and just adjust the Y scale value down to 0. I'm also going to hold down the Option key on the Mac, Alt on Windows, and hit the left bracket to trim this waterfall layer to this point, so that there aren't any extraneous pixels being calculated in the first 3 seconds of the composition. So now we can see that as soon as the first letter hits, those splashes kind of scale into place and look great. Now the second layer comes into place. As soon as it hits, we're going to need to animate the mask a little bit that's on our splashes. So let's go back to our selection tool. Let's turn on our mask view. Let's hit the letter M to reveal our mask shapes in the timeline. The one we want to deal with, we'll click on so that we can see it highlighted down here in the timeline. And I'm going to set a keyframe for mask shape at this point. I'm now going to scroll down, say another 5 or 6 frames, maybe 7 frames, and I'm going to animate this mask shape over just a bit. I might need to modify this shape a little bit to create a little bit more of a cascade effect. That's okay. You can tweak this any way that you like. So now as I scrub, you'll see the E comes into place, and a little more splashing comes in. We'll scrub a little over until it's time for the T to come into place. Once again, I'll set a keyframe for mask shape to hold it up till that point. Scrub forward just a few more frames, 6 or so, maybe 7, and then we'll drag the mask over now to reveal more of the splashes corresponding to our last letter. And now let's take a quick RAM preview of that and see what our results look like so far. And it looks pretty good. I think the scroll over of the reveal of the splashy text is not terribly convincing for the second couple. We'll probably want to shorten those down a little bit. But all in all, this is working pretty great. In order to shorten up that transition, let me shift-click on the second of each of these clusters of keyframes, and I'm just going to drag the keyframes to the left a little bit. This is an artistic process. This is something you'll need to tweak to get just the way you like it. But I pretty much know in my head that a shorter value is going to result in a better outcome. So I'm just going to drag that to the left, and I'm basically going to pronounce that done. So now things get pretty easy from this point out. I'm going to turn on our More layer. I'm actually going to apply an effect to this layer. So let me bring up our effects palette with Command 5. That's Control 5 on Windows. And I'm going to type in the word drop. That'll let me hone in on my drop shadow, which I'm going to apply to my More layer here. I'm going to go into my effects controls and just crank up my shadow opacity so it's a little darker, and adjust my softness value to something like 5 just to kind of soften up that shadow a bit. And I'm going to copy this filter, Command C, close down this window, close down my effects palette, turn on my less fat layer, highlight it, and paste. So I've now applied the same drop shadow to both of these layers. Now let's animate these little bits of text, and we're almost done. Let's go back to our More layer. I'm going to twirl it open and choose Animate, Scale. That brings up an animator for scale. I don't want to worry about adjusting the range selector this time. I just want to actually keyframe the scaling of this text. So let me actually scrub to the point where I think I want the word more to appear. And I think I want it to appear around about the time the E comes into frame, so that we've had time to establish the fact that the W's in, the W has plopped into place before we start confusing things with an additional piece of text animating in. So let's say that somewhere here, just before 4 seconds, is where we want the word more to be settled into place. So I'm going to set a keyframe for that just by clicking on the stopwatch in front of the word scale. Now I'm going to turn off the symmetrical scaling by clicking on the little chain link that we see here, and I'm going to scrub back around a second or so. Doesn't have to be precise. And I'm going to crank down just the X scale value to 0. It is possible to do a negative scale, so you actually have to hone in on that. So now our text is gone. Tap the space bar and you'll see that over a few frames it scales into place just along the x-axis. That's fine. Now, as soon as the T hits its mark, I want to animate in the less fat portion of our animation, and we'll almost be done. Now, in this case, I am going to work with a range selector and a couple of animators. So let me select my less fat layer. I'm going to close down my more layer and open up less fat. We want to animate the position, and we want to add a scale property to that as well. So what we're basically going to want to do is, once again, break this link. This time we're going to be animating just the Y value. So let's crank that down to 0 so that things will scale from basically flat as a pancake up to 100%. But I also want to adjust the position of this layer. I want to animate it from a higher point. So as it scales, it also kind of moves down. And the result of that is that it's going to look as if the baseline of the text is shifting. A really close look in the window will reveal 2 little red dots. Those dots give us a tiny hint of where our text actually is. And if I adjust the Y position of the text by clicking and dragging to the left, if you look very, very closely, you might be able to see it on screen. You might not. But if you look very, very closely on your screen, you should see some little dots that mark where the text appears on screen. And now that we've done that, all we have to do is set a keyframe for the start position of my range, scrub over around a second or so, and adjust that up to 100%. And that's going to reveal these letters one at a time. They're going to basically paint themselves onto screen while scaling down from a higher baseline that we were able to pull off by moving the position of the letters as well. If you're not grabbing this 100%, don't worry. We're going to go into type in great detail later on in the program. Once again, this isn't intended to be a follow-along. We're creating a project in an organic way. And the last thing that we need to pop into place is our bottle. Let me locate that in our project down here. I know it's in here somewhere, all the way down here at the bottom. I'm going to turn on the visibility for our bottle, drag it to the top. Actually going to scrub it to the right a bit because we don't need it to start till around 5 seconds or so in our composition. It only occupies the second half of it after all. Let's scrub to a point where the bottle stops spinning. And now let's drag it into place, scale it down a little bit, hold the Shift key to constrain the scale. A little more. I don't mind if it intersects our text just a little bit. I don't want it to obscure it and make it hard to read, but I don't mind if it intersects it a little bit. Now I'm going to hit the P key for position, set a keyframe at this point, scrub back just a couple of seconds. I don't need to have the entire rotation in frame, so I can clip off the first second of this. And I'm going to drag the bottle off the bottom of the screen, hold the Shift key down to constrain its axis. And the last thing I need to do is select that second keyframe and hit F9. That's going to ease that keyframe so that the bottle eases into place as it spins, settles into place, and we've got our final tableau. Let's generate a RAM preview of the work we've done and see what we've accomplished. So there we are, a complex result generated with just a handful of clips, a little bit of source footage. There's some tweaking we could still do. We might be able to tweak that last little bit of a splash reveal. We might want to color correct the background a little bit so it looks a little more blue. But all in all, we've done a pretty decent job of creating a very sophisticated effect in a very short period of time. Once again, I feel for you if you tried to follow along, as I moved along at a very, very quick clip. But from this point on, I hope you can keep up, because we're going to be taking a patient stroll now through the After Effects interface and taking a good close look at what everything does.